Everybody, welcome. This is our very first Growing Unicorns Live. We're very excited to have all of you here, have this discussion. This is going to be a kicking off point for us. So we're going to do this every single week, same time, same day. And generally, we aim to have different guests on the show with us who are leaders at unicorn companies, have experience from the trenches, both at a leadership level and executing, over their teams, to share stories and to talk about what's top of mind for us. So this is meant to be really casual, and we want there to be a lot of interaction from your part as the audience. So please comment in the chat if you have ideas, questions, topics. Nothing is off limits. So I will be keeping tabs on the chat. If you see me looking over here back and forth, that's what I'm doing. And we're gonna get things started. So Paul is our first guest. And I would love, Paul, for you to introduce yourself.
Hello, everybody. I'm Paul Darcy, and I'm CMO at Miro, the online whiteboarding company. I'm based here in Austin, Texas. I'm home right now. And then before this, for almost 8 years, I was CMO of the job site Indeed, which we grew from a little company to 250 million monthly users and 11,000 employees around the world. And I've been in tech for a while. My first CMO job was at one of the first 100 SaaS companies in existence, a company called Message One, which was started in '98. So I've been in Austin all of that time. So that's a little bit about me.
Amazing. Thank you, Paul. And then Holly is one of my co-hosts. So Holly, I'd love for you to introduce yourself.
Thanks, Eli. Oh, Paul, I'm so excited for our conversation today. I think it's going to be super fun. I currently work as an advisor, interim exec for SaaS companies. Currently, I work with Impera as their interim CRO and interim head of marketing at Loom and Topology. I was advising Miro before Paul's time, and I'm so glad to be able to chat through. And between us, we've seen Miro from 2020, 2021, these two amazingly transformative years. So I think it will be a really interesting conversation. Before becoming advisor full-time, I was at Slack, overseeing their global digital marketing from 100 million ARR to 700 million ARR and going public. And previously at Google was both a B2B and B2C functions. So really looking forward to the conversation today. We're going to talk about the intersections of brand and performance, which is one of my favorite topics. And we'll just chat and see where the conversation goes.
Perfect, Holly. Thank you. And then I'm going to plug for our co-host who is not here today, Karina. Her kiddo had 103 fever, so she had to run off to preschool and take care of that. Obviously, that's the top priority. So Karina's not here. She is the VP of Demand Gen and Growth at Mattermade, and I am the CEO of Mattermade, advise and help implement strategy and execution for unicorns. So Hopin, Calm, Loom, G2, Dropbox, a bunch of others. So very amped to talk about all the things that we think about on a daily basis and some of the hurdles and mountains that we've had to climb. And with that, let's kick it off. So Paul, I'm going to throw it over to you because I know you have this passion for the intersection of performance marketing and brand marketing on a more long-term horizon. So can you explain to us just what does that mean to you and how did you come up with this niche spot?
I mean, my passion really is, as a marketer, is for driving growth. And it's that passion for driving growth that has brought me to think really deeply about that intersection between brand and performance. Also, I've, at this point in my career, probably invested about $5 billion in marketing spend through different experiments. And through those experiments over the years, have learned a lot. I think that the foundation for me is that people are not rational decision makers, and that emotions play a really important part in the decision-making process. And when you look right now at just the world of SaaS, there's 15,000 SaaS companies. I'm a marketer. A lot of us are marketers. There's more than 7,000 SaaS companies that sell to marketers. Pure performance marketing is not enough to cut through and to get people to make decisions in your favor. It takes a combination of long-term brand building and then, smart growth and performance marketing to optimize long-term growth for a business. So that's how I've gotten to a little bit of that perspective.
I love that. So here's a question, maybe this is for both of you. So I'll throw this to Holly first. Paul mentioned deploying a massive amount, I think you said 5 billion, into various channels over the course of your career. And Holly, I'm sure between Google, Slack, and others, you're probably in a similar space as far as the amount that you've deployed. Are there frameworks that you like to rely on? I know that playbooks aren't something that we like to talk about because they just change constantly and they're ever evolving. But frameworks, I think when it comes to testing and deploying spend, that you like coming back to as fundamental.
That's a really good question. I would love to hear how Paul thinks about it. I look at this from a different stage and the need of the company. In early days, you want to start thinking about the brand story, why the product exists, who does it exist for. So there's a foundational brand story and messaging there, and that helps the growth marketing team to deploy whatever campaign or create the channels that communicate those brand stories. In early days, running experiments to kick off some of these machines, so we know which channels might be working better than others, and then scaling from there. I have a theory that it's not necessarily tested or very wide. I'm curious how Paul, you look at it, is like in early days, almost like, yes, we have like two things we have to get right: like messaging, foundational messaging, and let's test growth channels in like very experimental way. And then it's growth become more important as we scale. And then at a certain point, only running demand gen and growth is going to limit yourself. And then we have to open up the top of funnel and building brands to almost change the curve to the next phase. So that's where a lot of the scaling stage companies get stuck because they become this more tactical tool versus what's the brand, what's the emotions, why people would spend $1 million versus $10,000 to buy your product. That's my Holly's theory. I would love to hear, Paul, your framework.
Yeah, I think responding, first of all, what you're saying makes a lot of sense, Holly, that early on in a business, the name is important, the identity is important, the customer experience, viral loops and word of mouth are for sure incredibly important. And it's that combination of things that I think gets to whatever that first threshold of scale is. And then at the point that, there's significant paid acceleration of the business, I think it should be a mix of performance and brand. When it comes to frameworks, I think there's a couple of things. The most basic thing when I think about marketing is that what we're trying to do is acquire the most long-term value at the lowest cost. And so it's that, ratio between long-term value and customer acquisition costs. That's the key at this. And then one of my core beliefs is that most of the arbitrage value in marketing sits in the things that are the hardest to measure. And so with that, a lot of the first go-to growth channels like paid search, are priced to the least sophisticated buyer. And, when you go to the things that are hardest to measure, radio, I think, is probably the hardest thing to measure. There's enormous opportunities to spend and to drive value that, there's very few people who have the experience and have run those experiments and figured that stuff out. So I kind of combine those concepts. It's, where can we look for opportunities to drive, growth most profitably, being creative around how we measure, how we design experiments, and knowing that we want to balance short and long term. And there's probably a few interesting things also to talk about in that.
It's interesting to tie this back to, I mean, you can see some of this happening in the market, and there's certain types of marketers that almost are a signal or a flag for a business shifting strategy or prioritizing brand into their mix. Like you see, was it Zoom Info just brought on Shane as their CMO. He was previously at Intercom, took Intercom through a rebrand and like repositioning to not just be, what their Series A through Series B or C story was, and be much more about brand. Same thing with Hopin, bringing in Anthony as their CMO. Both of these guys are very traditionally like, they're all about brand, right? And so this is clear play where they're thinking, okay, if we want to have a long-term staying power that isn't just the utility of what it was this year, and also drive down our cost to acquire over that longer time horizon outside of paid or industry tailwinds, brand is a bet that those companies are clearly making in a big way.
And you see that in the biggest companies too. Obviously, you look at Google and Amazon and Facebook and others, and there are companies, in particular Google and Amazon, that skewed traditional advertising for a very long part of their evolution, and now are some of the biggest spenders in that domain. I think Amazon is the #1 spender now in the U.S. Apple, obviously, for a very long time has done enormous brand building. There's plenty of B2B companies in that list as well, IBM and others.
Yeah. Holly, at Slack in the early days when you were there, how was this balanced, like the blend between performance and brand?
It's a good question. So in early days, I'd say Slack was very much focused on viral growth and product growth. So it's really about end user experience. Then marketing primarily focused on product marketing and content marketing. We actually have a fantastic blog. Several people are typing, and like people love it. It's all about long form journalistic coverage, not necessarily like SEO optimized articles, but really like more brand building articles. And then when Slack went to more the scaling stage, right around, I'd say like 70, 100 million ARR, we started doing more of the like actual growth marketing work. So like SEO and paid media, and scaling the website, testing, etc. And then when I'd say it's almost pretty mature stage, we started running brand. Actually, like at one point we did run a earlier brand campaign pretty early on. That was helpful. But yeah, like brand as a concentrated effort came in later. Though there is a difference between brand media campaign and building a brand through PR or organic, or just telling the story through user experience. I think that for the second of like building the brand story via organic channels, it's throughout. But launching a big brand campaign came in later.
Got it. Interesting.
I'm curious what Paul's experience has been like. At what stage do you see do you see a difference between brand building versus a brand campaign, and at what stage these activities come in?
And so I think it may be a perfect segue even just to talking about. I mean, I give you what I think everyone has a different definition of what brand versus performance is. And so I can give you my definitions on brand for performance and what I mean by those things. Mm-hmm. So for me, there's two ways that you can sell something as a marketer. Performance marketing tends to be some variation of a rational direct response communication. It is explaining something and its value and getting someone to take immediate action. That includes search ads. It includes most ads that are on YouTube. It includes most social ads. It includes display. It includes the way direct mail is typically executed, and then it includes performance variations that exist on other channels, including radio and TV. And those things tend to work purely through a short-term, immediate response to that action. Their effects are very short-lived. They're typically, the effects of those advertisements may be gone in minutes or days. When I talk about brand building, what I'm talking about is emotional priming to create memory structures and to increase the propensity of self-adoption over a very long period of time. And it tends to lean into very simple messages: who the brand is, what it looks like, what it's called, what it's for, and then triggering very strong emotional response, typically through a media that's able to, carry emotion, like streaming video or TV, or sometimes audio. And, so those sorts of things tend to increase sales over the very long time. And the ideal is really to get those things in balance. The more you increase consideration, the more likely people are to take action on all of your, advertising media. That's the way I think about those two things. And then in terms of where they fit in the category, I think there's just different things you do at different stages. And so Miro, for example, used to be called real-time board. And real-time board was not something that was sitting in the best place in memory. It didn't have a particularly distinctive identity. And so the first optimization for memory for Miro was to change the name to Miro, and to really strengthen the identity. And that was a great foundation for increasing word of mouth, increasing memory. And it then now gives us a foundation to do other sorts of marketing. At Indeed, at the time I joined, the business was unheard of. We actually had almost negative brand consideration. We had more people using the product than were aware of it, mostly coming through search channels. We were really, really good at SEO and organic search. And so we drove really significant effects by just really emotional brand building. Again, a lot actually leaning into TV, although it was integrated, just to get more people to self-adopt on the B2C and B2B sides.
That's a really good framework.
So I have a question that I'd like to open up to the audience just to get them involved, which is, and I'm going to ask this both Paul, to you, and Holly. I'm curious, two things. One, what is the most top of mind strategic challenge and thereby opportunity that you're thinking through right now? It's like very top of mind. And then what's the most top of mind tactical challenge in the business right now that you're thinking through and feel like there's opportunity there? Holly, for you, if you can maybe pattern match to some of the companies that you're advising right now, if there's something that stands out there, and Paul, obviously with Miro. And then everyone who's listening in right now, if you can put what those two things are for you and your business in the chat, then that'll give us an opportunity to use those as points of discussion so we can have all the brains on stage right now talking through the problems that you're really trying to solve for at the moment. So Holly, I'm going to open for you.
I think the top of mind for me is measurement. All of us know it's important to build brand, and we know the usual suspects of building brands, right? Like telling PR stories, getting speaking slots at conferences, running TV, streaming, media campaigns. There are measurements. For example, you can work with a brand measurement partner to run surveys and crosstab to measure the effectiveness. At the same time, it's not necessarily super accurate or representative because it's a sample versus the entire thing. Measuring certain channels can be expensive as well. So marketers needs to be really intentional about channel level impact of a holistic integrated campaign. We can say we spend $5 million, have these 5 channels, but which channels are actually effective, or what are each channel's role in this holistic campaign? So measurement, it would be the most top of mind from both the strategy and tactical perspective, and the impact on performance marketing, on conversion rates, on the bottom line, as well as the time to observe those benefits. I'd say it's one of the top of mind things for all marketers, probably. Paul, what do you think?
Yeah, I mean, for me, the topical thing, I mean, so I've been at Miro less than a year. I joined last September. We've seen a lot of growth during that time. I think we've gone from 400 employees to about 1,000 in those 10 or 11 months. And for me, it's just kind of hiring great leaders and putting together kind of a full marketing organization that does all of the pieces, from the growth marketing to brand to community to the enterprise side of our business to all of the depth that we need around product marketing around the world. So that for sure is the work that I'm really deeply in, is building up all these functions and capabilities for a growing and changing organization.
I love that. All right, so we've got our first couple questions coming in here, so we're going to take them live. The first one is from Manami over at Mooksoft, and so she said, tactical, testing performance marketing channels that drive effective adoption and growth for a tech buying audience, where their main buying pattern is buying from community-led brand referrals, and they are big fans of ad blockers. Would love any ideas. Have either of you have experience with a technical audience in particular?
Typically, very developer focused audience don't like to, they use ad blockers a lot, and they don't want to be marketed to, especially display ads wouldn't work very well with that audience. So we typically try to go after more of a channel where the developers already trust and love. So we know they congregate at like Stack Overflow or Hacker News or Reddit. There are also like private marketplaces where it's websites that they already use, like Dribble, etc. So being present on those platforms, as well as being in those platforms in a non-intrusive way, is where we test a lot of this. And then another one I recently started testing is community driven referral. So depending on your resource level, you could create a community. Let's say everyone who is a data scientist, and you can have a data scientist community where you share best practices, and among them it's where all data scientists to share best practices. At the same time, it also takes lots of effort in managing a community, and it's harder to measure, what percentage of your referral actually came from the community versus others. So it needs to be a very intentional choice, and it probably initially have to be more of a let's try this out for a while, knowing that we may not see very direct response type of impact in the short term.
I don't have too much to add. I would just say that I don't have a lot of expertise in these channels, but certainly understand the channels, certainly understand the challenges, and have watched some companies like Atlassian navigate this stuff brilliantly. I mean, I think that those are real obstacles, and yet still continually running experiments on performance channels, trying different creative approaches. We're seeing where you can lean into amplifying community or evangelists, or other people that are trusted, for sure can help. And, but yeah, the ad blockers are for sure going to take away, some of your ability to reach people, and hopefully there's ways to increase performance around that to get around that or to try channels that, are harder to block.
Yeah, on this, I think it's important to get the mix right. Like you want to continuously be testing performance marketing initiatives in these niche channels, like all the places that they're hanging out that Holly mentioned. But then there's also this long game that I think maps back to the close equivalent would be brand marketing, but it's just called DevRel, right? Where it's like, what's your blend of performance marketing initiatives and tests and budget against the more like mid and long-term initiative of developer relations. We see all of the most successful product-led, you're thinking about like the GitHubs and the GitLabs of the world, Atlassian even for certain products, where they're beloved amongst that community. And that isn't something that you can go for a conversion event up front with. But in the same way that I think we were talking about brand earlier, that is something that you can invest in over the long haul and find ways to build goodwill in the community so that when the conversation about the category that your product is in comes up, you're the first that's mentioned and you're the brand that these developers want to attach themselves to. It almost makes them feel cool. So great questions. I'm going to jump over to Michael Brooks from Weatherbug, who has two questions for us. The strategic challenge. I love this one, by the way, Michael. How do we prepare for a future less reliant on shifting ad tech, Apple and Google? We'll start with that one. Either of you guys want to jump in on that?
I'm for sure glad to. It feels very familiar to me because of so much time and money that I've spent on channels that don't have those same measurement approaches. I think that there's a few ways that I think about this. One is just experiment design, doing different, whether it's geo splits or whatever, controls and holdouts that you can set is really key. Still there's I find a surprising number of places where there's options for, server to server measurement approaches. Obviously the major ad providers have, direct integration methods. There's even things like pod sites that I use for podcast tracking where we can, directly connect and see who in our funnel has been exposed to our podcast ads. There's TV equivalents of those like iSpot that allow, TV measurement of this. And so it isn't as easy as it was, having, expertise on those sorts of getting your data clean and your data pipeline abilities strong, and then doing those server to server integrations becomes really important to making this stuff work. But I feel like I'm not seeing, too much in the way of limitations from these changes that are coming in terms of what our marketing teams are able to do on the performance side. And it's a combination of those things that allows that.
Yeah, I also observed a trend that a lot of more traditional channels, we're talking about like TV and audio and out of home, becoming more digitally integrated. So you can digitally buy streaming spots and a connected TV, even like a podcast, a broadcast TV, and connect that with your digital measurement systems. So like there are vendors who integrate with like Google Analytics, for example, and connects those audiences. So they're constantly more new technical solutions that are trying to solve this issue. I agree with Paul that first party data is becoming more and more important in driving this, and owning your existing audience and model against that is probably the way to go. But I know, for Michael, the IDFA, like that impacts a lot more of the app ecosystem, in addition to the desktop world.
So I'm curious, we've been talking a fair amount a bit about these what might be considered like alternative, at least in B2B, a little bit alternative or on the fringe channels, like leveraging, ads in Hulu or like podcasts, these sorts of things that folks get around to at some point when they're doing channel expansion, but aren't necessarily a major part of their go-to-market per se. Paul, I'd love to ask you the question at Miro, like, what are you seeing that excites you in that space? And maybe if you're comfortable sharing some specific stories of campaigns that you've run that have performed really well, and maybe some that you thought would perform well and didn't, that you removed from your experiment.
Just based on where I am in the evolution, it's probably better for me to give you some of the Indeed stuff because we live that end to end, and Miro stuff's still in development, so I can't talk about what's coming. But on the Indeed side, I mean, I can say the following, right? That we were a top 10 U.S. radio advertiser. And so, I mean, we spent on radio at an enormous scale, but, I mean, we tested across pretty much every channel that existed. And it really is the mix. I mean, I would say that a couple of things, the first is what are you trying to accomplish with that channel? And my experience with performance is that, you exhaust the digital stuff relatively quickly as you get to scale. Like if you're, a business that is likely to get towards $1 billion or into the multi-billion-dollar range of revenue, you will have exhausted digital channels a long time ago, somewhere in the hundreds of millions of revenue. You will be spending all that you can on Google, all that you can on Facebook. Some will have figured out YouTube. And so then you need to figure out what are your other sources of performance growth. And, you have to go to the big channels that are TV, radio, podcast, and streaming audio and some of these other things, and able to get to real scale. And there's enormous opportunity in those channels, and they're a lot of fun actually to work with once you start getting into them. Audio is a lot easier than video, obviously, because of the creative that you use with that. Podcast is a great starting point for people trying to do other things because it's digital, fully measurable. You can get an agency that manages a lot for you, but all of that stuff I find really exciting. And that's still all performance. And then it gets a little bit trickier when you want to get brand in the mix to raise, consideration and drive long-term growth, and to do that emotional priming, because there's a much narrower set of channels that can be used for brand building to drive long-term growth. And there are almost no digital channels that are effective for that.
I'm super curious, like Paul, what metric do you use to measure your brand efforts?
I mean, so for me, to me, brand and performance should be measured on the exact same thing, which is revenue, cost of acquisition, and the long-term value that you're generating from, the advertising spend that you're doing. But I think that there's a bunch of critical things in terms of how you measure that. So when you're doing a performance marketing campaign, you'll generate short-term effects and no long-term effects for the most part. There's very little change in brand consideration that comes from most performance marketing campaigns. When you're doing emotional priming long-term campaigns, you'll generate short-term effects that are probably smaller than what you would generate on performance marketing, but then you'll generate a very, very long tail of conversions, or incremental adoption or incremental impact in the other channels, and that stuff is really hard to measure. And so that is the entire trick in being able to measure this, but you've got to bring that back to revenue. And so there's a few ways that you do that. For me, it's important to have just brand tracking so that you can see what's coming from performance and what's coming from changes in consideration. And so brand tracking tends to be survey driven, where you're looking at, unaided measures of changes in people's willingness to buy your product or use your service. I think then the critical thing to tease out long-term and short-term performance is econometric modeling. My last team, we had, a PhD former professor who was part of our full-time team, and whose entire job was just doing econometric modeling to understand and tease out performance between short-term and long-term. But all of that for me just comes back to revenue over different timeframes.
That's really good point. It's like you run surveys while you run the brand campaign, so you know the incremental lift of consideration, and then you observe the after effects over time.
And that's the trick. It's that there's two types of advertising, again, performance and brand. Both of them generate short-term effects. Most measurement is just of short-term effects. And so when you're running what you think is a brand campaign, you don't know if most brand campaign work by tech companies winds up being performance marketing over brand channels because they're afraid to move away from rational messaging to emotional messaging. And there's someone in their business who are saying, you haven't shown enough of the product or told enough of the story or explained all the features or done all of that. And if you start doing any of that, you've already lost. And so like strong brand advertising is going to be, deeply emotional. And that's what drives that memory. And so, yes, what you want to do is, it takes 6 months typically to see brand effects. And so what you want to do is be tracking brand consideration continuously over that. And you want to see those things move together. And then you need to be able to link that consideration change back to increases in the performance marketing, conversions that come from over time, and econometric marketing modeling can help with that. And so, as well as, other things like branded search, SEO impact, all of which are also going to be related to that.
I think this ties into something you were saying, Paul. Reminds me of this thing that I see constantly, and I'd imagine, Holly, in your advising stints, you also see this, where companies who are on not the Indeed level of scale, like they maybe just got their unicorn status and they're in hyper growth, but there's this tendency because of that early stage to everything goes through the product lens. All of the copywriting, all of the campaigning, all of the hypotheses and tests are through the lens of features and through the lens of the voice of the product, essentially, as opposed to what are the underlying human emotions that your buying committee is experiencing or going through. Like what is the thing that allows the person you're trying to get to adopt or sell to turn their phone off on the weekends and enjoy their kid's soccer game, right? And like most companies, it takes them a while to get to this point of maturity where they understand that marketing to that is much more powerful, or can be much more powerful than marketing the product, marketing the features, and being much more literal about how they're going to market. Paul, does that feel like it's the parallel, the earlier stage parallel to what you've described?
Yeah, I think so. I think that's right. And I think, like, for all of us, if I grew up in New York City, in Manhattan, and if I look back to when I was a kid so long ago, I can still remember a zillion advertisements from those days. And I was bombarded every time you walked down the street with someone handing out flyers. I started doing that myself when I was 6 years old. And I can't remember any of the things that was ever on any of those flyers. Those were all performance marketing activation things. It just doesn't stick with you. But there are other types of advertising that get wound into culture, that get wound into memory, and they're designed to really connect and impact you. And there's a lot of that out there. And I think the interesting thing is for tech companies to figure out how they become memorable. And there are other paths to this for sure. Like Tesla is not famous because of doing brand advertising. It is through PR and communications and product, and obviously, a founder who's great at generating attention. But I think every business can figure out where to sit in this and how to get noticed and to get remembered. And I think the key thing to think about is that everyone has endless choices right now. It's like if you're a SaaS company, there's 15,000 other companies and no one cares about your business. And so really, how do you sneak into people's memories and become one of the brands, because every category becomes a brand shortcut at some point in time. And you look at just the way people dominate, whether it's Salesforce to Slack, all one now, but but for sure, like you've got to be able to drive growth, but also be able to drive memory share, which becomes consideration share, which is equally important.
Okay, so here's a out of a box question. If we want to lengthen the memory and get emotional response, let's say, what if we create a emotional, let's say YouTube video that and use performance tactics and run it as a performance channel, let's say like YouTube for action, right? Like very typical performance channel, but having an emotional messaging. Would that work? And would you consider that as like brand or performance?
It is such a great question. So so for sure, I had this thought, at Indeed, it's an obvious thing, right? TV was working for us. YouTube has got to work. And in fact, like when TV is dying and people aren't watching TV, where do you go next? And it seems so obvious that YouTube is where you go next. And so we did a fair number of experiments on this. And what we found was that we could not run, even with custom assets or the same assets, that we could not get consideration lift off YouTube. The only thing we could do is that we could extend campaigns that were running on TV with YouTube and get some incremental lift. And it perplexed me. And then I ran into Karen Nelson Fields, who's a professor. She wrote like The Attention Economy. It's an incredibly important book for any growth marketer to read. And Karen Nelson Fields out of Australia has studied this for years. And what she looks at is the memory effects of different channels. And what it turns out is that there's a couple of things that determine how much memory effect is generated by a channel. One is obvious, and it's just screen pixel coverage, and then the other is the level of attention. But it's actually that screen pixel coverage that's really important. And it turns out that YouTube is typically watched on a mobile device, and it's typically watched vertically. And it covers something like 30% of the screen, and there's a lot of other things happening. And it doesn't drive very strong memory effects. The memory effects from YouTube last 8 days in terms of their effects on sales. And for TV, it's 109 days. And so it's a pretty significant difference. Facebook is even worse than YouTube. And it's the same thing. It's just lower pixel coverage for video. It's also watched more passively than Facebook. And so what that research, which I've seen in experiment shows as well, is that YouTube is a really difficult performance channel. I'll also just note that I've met with a lot of people at Google, but it's probably not a coincidence that the memory effects of YouTube last 8 days and that the brand lift studies are typically conducted after 7.
Interesting. Eli, have you seen your clients running into this performance versus brand and how they think about a holistic structure?
Yeah, I mean, especially lately, it feels like it feels as though there are these waves that go through the valley that end up emphasizing certain elements or approaches to marketing, right? Like there was the big ABM wave where that was everyone was talking about. And there was a period where even mentioning brand marketing was almost like the soft thing that nobody wanted to talk about, or that it felt like a weakness instead of a strength. And I think it's probably part one, because we're talking about earlier stage, like series B through 100 million in ARR, and not the later stage where they understand brand. But then also just, I think, the trends that go through the valley. So now we're seeing a lot more emphasis on this conversation and finding the right blend. Then there's also, even if we think about the Dropboxes of the world, it's interesting to see these brands struggle is a strong word to use, but tussle with what the right part of this to lean into is, and how to make it still connect with who they are as a company, right? Like I think famously there was this campaign that Dropbox put out, maybe it was 3 years ago now, that was just like not well received at all. It was very.
Like, I remember like a pink flying boat or something like that. Is that
Yep, that's the campaign.
Yeah.
Yeah. And you can go and read the YouTube comments, and it's like it's just getting flamed for missing the mark in such a major way. And I say this as someone who's an advisor to the company on marketing, but so I think that's an example of a company trying, like, caught in between this identity and how much emphasis and how to put the emphasis on brand while not losing sight of performance marketing. That's a little bit of a rant, but
I think there's two really interesting lessons, though, in the Dropbox story. One is that if you're a B2B product-led growth company, you've got three things that have to come together, and it's incredibly difficult to do this, and it tends to be different people in the organization. And that is category definition, core product marketing, positioning, and messaging, and then brand strategy. And that all needs to be part of, one identity. And often these things get fragmented or done in different ways or at different times. And so it's really hard to pull that off. I think that the other thing is, Dropbox has not been successful, I don't believe, with their brand investments. And they know, because enough people have told them that, and I don't have any internal view into this, but I've talked to so many PLG companies. And the fact of the matter is that PLG doesn't last forever. And at some point, your top of funnel slows down. And you need to balance that with more traditional methods of sales and more traditional methods of growing that top of the funnel. And I would assume that that's one of the reasons why Dropbox keeps experimenting with these sorts of brand things. I think the thing that I see in a lot of businesses is that they don't experiment at the right level. Brand building actually is a pretty significant investment, and that investment gets a lot higher the more rigid a category has become. And I think Dropbox is an incredibly rigid category in terms of the lines. It's a lot harder now to move someone from Google Drive to Dropbox if your starting point is today than at the point that Dropbox started. And so the price of that and the experiment is probably a really significant thing. And people often try to dip their toes in, and it's very hard to make that work.
Completely. Yeah. It's the arm not talking to the leg, not talking to the ear problem. And then also, as some of these companies grow, we'll continue to run with the Dropbox as the specific example, but file sync and share, which is their category traditionally, has become a commodity. So then the question is almost an identity threat of okay, if we're trying to not just be file sync and share, but we are, but everybody knows this is file sync and share, these brand bets get even murkier, because it's what you said, category definition, I think, which totally resonates, is if you're having a challenging time, or not even challenging time, but just if you're in the midst of figuring out where you want to define yourself, of course, launching a brand level campaign it's going to come off the way that campaign did.
I'll go ahead. Yeah, I have a follow-up question.
It brings back the early days at Indeed. We competed against a brand behemoth, which was Monster, and people said, "There's no way you're going to ever be Monster." Most people said, "I don't even remember Monster." But the lesson, I think, in Monster is it's a company that had incredibly high awareness and low consideration. People knew it exists, but didn't necessarily want to use that. And when categories shift or your business needs to shift, I do think it's much harder to take one brand from one part of the world to another space, which may be the Dropbox thing, than to build a new brand from scratch as a different company. And so those are very difficult situations to be in.
How do you think about category definition, Paul? We can say Miro is a online whiteboard, or we can say it's online collaboration, or we can say it's digital transformation. How do you think about category definition, especially in the context of everyone trying to create a category?
Yeah. So my starting point for category creation, I think, first of all, that category creation for a business to business PLG SaaS company is a little bit complex, because there's two audiences. One audience is the users you're trying to attract, and then the other audience is a really narrow set of like analysts, enterprise buyers, and maybe pundits. And so I think those things require a little bit of different consideration. I tend to start with the user side first. And so when I think about the user side, I tend to be thinking, when I think in general about marketing, I think often about non-users and people who have no awareness of me, and try to have as much marketing speak to people that are non-users, because that's the way that you drive growth. And so the lens for category creation for me is simplicity and understanding. It's one of the reasons why at Miro, we talk a lot about being an online whiteboard. Miro is so powerful and deep a visual collaboration platform, and an online whiteboard absolutely does it a disservice. But I need a starting point for someone who has no idea what this category is and hasn't experienced to be able to reference. And so for me, that's a really powerful starting point. And so I start with simplicity and accessibility in someone's mind. It needs to be something that it can be explained almost instantaneously, even if it doesn't get the full value. On the enterprise side, it's trickier, and I think you just need to tell a richer, more nuanced story, and you may name that category and put language around that. That's different.
So that's more like to the investors, to the analysts, and sort of the
CIOs who have to sign a check. Yeah, for sure. And it is reasonable. There's a different conversation you need to have around value than getting a user to get going and to solve their own things. We exist as PLG companies in both these worlds.
Yeah, I have a related question about rebrand, because Miro went through this rebrand, and Slack changed its logo, which was like a huge effort, and SurveyMonkey recently changed its name to Momentous. I'm curious about your view on when should you do a rebrand? Should you do a rebrand? How do you approach about thinking through this question?
So naming is a different issue too, but I actually think that one of the most important things around long-term memory is being recognizable. And that in a lot of cases, distinctiveness is actually more important than differentiation. And that's a controversial statement in a lot of circles, but distinctiveness, being very clearly recognizable and able to drive memory is really, really important. And so when I think about a rebrand, it's how do I create distinctive assets that I can invest in and grow and measure. And I can give you a couple of examples of that. One of the obvious ones is just owning a color. And there are a lot of opportunities for that. At Miro, I love our yellow and black, which of the core logo is just recognizable and different and stands out. And so that's helpful in a world where a lot of things are blending together. A friend of mine is CMO of the National Lottery of Ireland, and his entire focus has been on building a campaign that is actually focused on winners going and installing water slides in their house. And they're these giant, big plastic water slides, but all of their campaigns are built around that. And now they can run like a 5-second teaser ad that is just a water slide going across a bridge on a giant truck, and people immediately recognize that as being associated with the lottery. And so these assets can come from a lot of places, and they can even be fun, but I think the key thing is to try to have something that's uniquely associated with your brand and can be used to trigger that memory.
So with 4 minutes left, as we wind down, I have a question. Well, first, housekeeping reminder for everybody here. We're going to be doing this again, same time next week with a different guest. So Paul, I really appreciate you taking the time to chat with us and nerding out on all these different topics. I think we covered some really fun ground today. And then Paul, this one's for you. So I would love for you to nominate unofficially 3 marketing leaders who you think would be really fun and interesting to have on the show currently at unicorn companies.
Yeah, great. Do I get some time to think about that?
Yeah, you can think about it. You can think about it. And while you're thinking about it, I'll put a challenge back to the audience as well. If there are any topics that are really top of mind and that you'd like us to specifically bring up next time, or maybe things that you wanted to ask that didn't have a chance to this time, put them in the chat so we know what you're thinking. And yeah.
So a couple, I've got some people that I'd like to nominate.
Awesome.
So I would like to nominate, well, for sure, Juliet Slack, who I've known for decades. David Asana, and then the third person, I don't know the person, but I would love to nominate whoever runs marketing at Canva, because they have really done a phenomenal job at balancing the different pieces to drive growth.
I love
I'm
that.
talking to Tiffany at Canva, so I'll nudge.
Yeah.
Amazing. Well, again, this was really fun. Holly, always great to co-host with you. And Paul, thank you again. And everybody who showed up.
It was awesome. It's great.
Yeah, it's so fun. Yes. Thank you so much, Paul. Really appreciate it. Thanks for being brave and being the first guest.
Yeah, that was great. Well, I love being part of this. So thank you for including me. Always happy to participate and help out.
All right, everybody. Have a great night.
Have a great night, everyone.